After finally catching up to all 1,443 chapters of Hajime no Ippo up to the day of this recording, the next challenge was to decide how I wanted to go about talking about all of this. And I think the most efficient thing for me, considering that I have a few other big projects I want to work on, and there's a lot of other videos I want to do on Hajime no Ippo, is to first do one where it's just my unfiltered thoughts on the series, just sort of a conversation between me and you. And so consider this a letter of appreciation to Hajime no Ippo, a love letter, if you will, but that sounds a little too much, although that might be the title of the video. Hajime no Ippo, given its very long chapter count, such a series like One Piece, is one of those things that a lot of people might not want to get into or read. I also did check out the anime, which I was thoroughly enjoying and watching with some friends. However, I felt for the sake of, again, efficiency to get through all of it and to be able to talk about it, I went, the manga route. And I want to say that if there was any way I could sell you Hajime no Ippo, is not by just telling you it's one of the best things I've ever read, because that is my opinion of the series, but after all 1,400 plus chapters, I'm not satisfied and I wanted more. And I can't say I've ever felt that way about any other series that I've ever read. It's sort of that completion sort of feeling when you've been deeply immersed into something, like for those that maybe the first time they ever beat a Soulsborne game, where it's like, you beat it, and then there's this sense of accomplishment, but then this immediate sense of emptiness where it's like, I will never get to experience this for the first time again. And that's how I feel after catching up to this series. Hajime no Ippo starts off following the main character, Ippo, Makunouchi. I think that's how you pronounce the last, I forget how Japanese names work. I know, just... you follow Ippo, who, he's getting bullied. He's this very mild and meek personality, right? One that a lot of people would look at and assume is not built for the role of boxer at all. One fateful day, Takamura, the best boxer at this respective gym, catches Ippo being beat up, and he intervenes, and Ippo says that he wants to learn to be strong, and so Takamura tests him, and basically is like, listen, you got to be able to do all this exercise for like a month and all that. He tests him first by having him like punch a tree and then have to catch a certain amount of leaves, and Ippo, after a lot of hard work, manages to do so, and then begins his boxing journey and career from that point onwards. There's a lot that happens in this series, and following the journey of Ippo is a very unique experience in the sense that no other series, I think, has ever made me feel like every single victory is more deserved and every single loss is more brutal for the character. Which, by the way, spoilers. There's going to be some heavy spoilers I'm going to get into later on to address certain things within the series. So if this is the moment where you haven't gotten into it, I suggest you watch some of my other videos. There's a manga recommendation one I did recently. I think you should check that one out. But for those that are still here, following the journey of Ippo is one of the most satisfying things. As a lot of other fighting series, you do get immersed and you do become very invested into the outcome of the main character. But with Ippo, it genuinely feels like you are side by side with a friend on this journey that is so much more than just boxing. And there's some of the other martial arts and boxing series that I've read that the combat sport in which they are a part of is a smaller sort of dose for what is kind of a philosophy on life, if you will, the way to go about living, to pull yourself back up, the meaning of love, the meaning of what it is to be strong. And that is a major theme for Ippo's character, what it means to be strong, and seeing that being tested throughout all of the different rivalries that he has. Ippo as a main character is one that is tested constantly, and what blew me away a lot about the series was its ability to be able to constantly throw in new challenges that were able to keep me engaged. I never felt like Ippo went up against something where I was like, oh, this again, and I became uninterested. No, it felt like the proper progression for Ippo's character, because not every challenge is the same. Every single aspect of who he is as a boxer is tested throughout the story, and on top of that, every single aspect of who he is as a person. seeing him become stronger, be it hold on to that lovable personality that makes him so easy to get behind and to root for. It's sort of the concept behind pro wrestling. You see this underdog, the little guy with a very likable personality versus this big bad who you want to see him beat. It's that very easy, humane response to root for the little guy. And seeing that guy grow and grow and grow and grow and eventually reach heights that, looking back into where the story started, it's kind of crazy just how much the character has to go through to reach those heights. It's such a beautiful thing to see. But the long chapter count might be a bit off-putting, since I think a lot of people might see the name of the series, Hajime no Ippo, and the main character being Ippo, and think that the series is completely focused on him. And of course he is the main character, but one of the strengths of this series isn't just Ippo, but it's the entire cast. Now, of course, there are characters in this series, just like there is in a lot of fighting series, where once they beat this person, that person no longer really becomes relevant to the story. And there are characters like that in Ippo, but I think Ippo has the strongest example of using characters and bringing them back into the story and allowing them to develop so much more to where they sort of feel like their own main character. Therefore, the story really has a lot of these other different storylines that are engaging beyond just Ippo. And the length of the series is due to the author taking that extra step of going beyond just backstories, but also going through and continuing to follow what this character is going through and their progress in the world of boxing. Because to contrast it to a series like One Piece is a far more plot-driven story. There's a lot of different aspects to the world of One Piece that play into the world building. Versus Ippo, it's a very strong character-driven story. And so there is a long chapter count, but that's due to this focus on so many different characters. Like, there will be legit 50 chapter plus stretches where, even though of course it's relevant to Ippo's character as it is from his perspective, seeing these characters, progress and go through their own losses and wins, you also really get immersed into what each of these characters are dealing with. Takamura is a great example, sort of this all-invincible champion who is one of the strongest pieces of comedy relief the series has, but when he gets serious is easily one of the most respectable as well, and is a huge component as to why I love Ippo as a series. Some of the other at Ippo's gym that he's a part of, Aoki, who is the strongest, and his buddy in crime, Kimura, where they both have this amazing friendship, and neither of them are as talented or as successful, as yet you still get invested, and it's a far different sort of struggle that they have to go through versus Takamura and Ippo. As well as later you get Itagaki, who joins the gym, who is this talented prodigy. And we have to see how he sort of has to grow and develop and also accept losing and continue to push his boundaries. Even the coach of the gym is given this very heartfelt backstory with his best friend, and time is dedicated to that. So it feels like every important character you're introduced to is never unsatisfying, is never feeling like, oh, there could have been more done with this character. I don't think there's many times I've genuinely felt that within Hajime no Ippo, because it's not just the people within Ippo's gym, but the people that he faces off against. Mashiba, the Grim Reaper of the series, what is once the big bad, you get to see this beautiful development with his character and the way that he gets to progress with the series. Miyata, who is Ippo's rival in them two, which they have a conflict that still needs to be dealt with. Sendo is another one of my favorite characters, who is this sort of he's sort of like this slightly alternate version of Ippo, a far more aggressive personality, but is also easy as hell to root for. And so this long chapter count, I promise you, it is not because of a bunch of wasting filler that contributes to nothing. Not to say that there aren't some, relaxed chapters, because there definitely are, but it's because the author has chosen to go that extra step with all of these awesome characters and to continue to build upon them. And so it doesn't feel like a lot of other fighting series might feel like, where the main character is progressing and progressing and progressing while everybody else slowly grows more stagnant. No, it is a living and breathing world with characters that each have their own goals and motivations and are each striving for the top spot. They're not just there so Ippo can beat them and never have to contend with them ever again. And I know I've kind of gone on about this for quite a bit before I've even touched into the actual fights, but I legitimately think that if Ippo, the strongest thing it had was the fights before the characters, I don't think I would nearly love it as much. I think the fights are able to be as good as they are because the author has been willing to expand upon these characters and make them be so much more than just obstacles with some slightly sad backstories. No, they develop into something far more beyond that. Now, getting into the actual fights themselves, they're incredible. The author clearly has a love and respect for the sport of boxing, considering that there are so many different references to real-life boxers that go beyond just, for example, Mike Tyson and Ali. When it started off talking about the legendary Tommy Hearns, I was really pleasantly surprised myself, as I had heard about the flicker jab and Hajime no Ippo, and I myself have actually gotten into boxing recently, and Tommy Hearns is the boxer that my lanky ass has tried to be inspired by. So yes, I have slightly Mashiba Rio bias, but that's besides the point. But seeing the actual implementation of a lot of historic boxing techniques is a very fascinating thing, and I think anybody who loves boxing would easily love this manga. But for those who aren't really into boxing as a sport, I think a good testament of a really good sports manga is it's able to get people into a sport they were like never into before. I know Alex recently got into basketball because of Slam Dunk. I know my boy Broken Ronin got a little more into soccer because of Blue Lock, which I have my thoughts on Blue Lock, but that's nor here nor there. And Ippo, even though I myself growing up had already had a bit of a love for boxing, Ippo ignited something in me to be even more interested within the sport. But the actual fights themselves do such a good job of carrying momentum chapter to chapter, of delaying that gratification for us, the reader, to where when we finally get those payoffs or we finally get those moments where the person we wanted to win didn't win, it is so emotionally impactful. It feels like you almost watched a real fight between people you were invested in. I legitimately think the fights are great. The artwork is stellar. The paneling is good as well. Like there's nothing I could say about the fights that I would have any sort of complaints about. One of the things regarding the comedy relief that I want to get into a bit, because there are certain characters like with Takamura, but more so Aoki and Kimura a little bit, is I think the author also knows the exact right times to implement comedy, the moments of when to relieve such high moments of tension, because you'll go stretches of like 30 and 40 chapters of just very intense, just the most intense thing the character has to go through in preparation for the fight, in the fight itself, and feeling like this is a genuine turning point for the character that will change things forever. And it's really nice to see the author know when to implement those moments of comedy and not sabotage his own writing with it. Like, I've never felt like there was this huge important turning point for Ippo and then it was quickly ruined by some comedic moment because the author didn't want to go all in with it. Like, no, it's never been that way. So that's something I greatly appreciate. Some of my favorite fights in the series, off the top of my head, if outside of the Ippo fights and some of the Takamura ones with like Brian Hawk, for example, was one of my favorites, as well as against Mike. Ippo versus Volg, the Russian boxer, was really great. Volg is another example, I didn't mention him earlier, of one of the characters that I'm so glad was continued to be expanded upon. Ippo versus Sendo. Sendo versus, I'm forgetting his name, the Mexican boxer. I'm trying to remember his name. Oh, how am I forgetting? That was like one of the more recent fights. But Sendo versus that character was great. Mashiba versus, was it Sumawara? Sumawara, I believe. Yeah, Mashiba versus Sumawara. My fault. Versus Sumawara. That fight was hype. As soon as I realized they were putting those two together, oh man, I knew I was going to love that fight immediately. A lot of the Itagaki fights are really cool to see as well as Miyata, seeing their very different style of fighting compared to people like Ippo and Sendo, who are far more in-fighter brute types. I think every Mashiba fight I tend to enjoy a lot, as well as the Aoki and Kimura fight, seeing how they have to contend with losing and not being nearly as excellent as Takamura and Ippo is one of those very relatable things. And again, I know I like harped on the characters a lot, but I think there is without a doubt, if you read Hajime no Ippo, you are going to find a character you deeply resonate with. And if there's one quick slight nitpick, I don't know if I'd consider it a criticism or more so of a personal nitpick. I'll let those of you listening to this sort of decide. But I think because the series is focused so much on the fights of all these different characters and their journeys throughout the boxing world, there is a romance dynamic that is implemented with Ippo and Kumi-san, which is Mashiba's sister. And I don't want to say it's bad, but I think, and it's largely felt in the recent chapters, it's felt largely stagnant for a series that is 1,400 chapters. For their romance to be in the state that it is right now, I think is kind of embarrassing. Maybe embarrassing is too strong of a word, but maybe it's just me who's sort of like, okay, come on, like let's move on to the next phase of this. It genuinely feels like the relationship between these two has not grown up. Like the way that their dynamic is now is the same it was back in chapter like 200 and something, and I don't think that's a very good thing. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not that I'm not invested in the romance, it's just it's a bit frustrating at this point. But one of the things that I really love about Ippo, now that I got that slight negative out of the way, is not only knowing when to push and challenge Ippo to beyond his breaking point, but it's also when to incorporate loss in the series. Because that is an aspect of boxing, and it's one of the things in just series in general that I kind of look forward to in a character, which might sound very sadistic, but I think you have to have a little bit of sadism in you as a writer and what you're going to put your characters through. And I'll give these two other external examples, which I've given many times in my recent Berserk chapter reviews, talking about the current state of Guts' character, which, by the way, some slight spoilers for Berserk, but Guts is at a current point as a character where he's been very broken and defeated, and this isn't new for the character. However, he's one that we typically classify with a lot of anger, with sort of this embodiment of human willpower, and to see that will broken, to see him really down and distraught and in despair is something that is a very painful thing to see the character go through, but something we can all resonate with, since we've all been in moments in our lives and cycles where it doesn't feel like there's any light at the end of the tunnel. Rurouni Kenshin is another story that implements this, with the main character also having a phase he goes through for a stretch where he's lost and he doesn't know how to get back up, or whether it's really worth getting back up. And Ippo knows exactly when to implement that type of loss within the series. Because one of the core thing, the core motivation for Ippo as a character, because there's a lot of temporary goals, right? There's a lot of short-term and longer-term goals in the physical sense that exist for Ippo, like beating this opponent, his long-term rivalry with Miyata. But the big thing with Ippo is what it truly means to be strong. And I don't want to jump the gun, because Ippo himself is yet to fully realize what that is, to find that answer for himself yet. But I think in a lot of the losses Ippo has gone through, especially with this recent stretch within the story, those who caught up know what I'm talking about, and I'll get into it a little more when I talk about my recent thoughts on the stuff that's been going on in the last, 200 chapters. But I think seeing Ippo climb these incredible heights, to start off in the Rookie King tournament and make it all the way up to challenge how hard you get hit in life, I think this is something that we see very well with a character like Takamura, the brutal beatings he goes through to the point where his hair changes. But he's still able to get back up, and he's still able to carry it. I love that sort of thing he said, where when you're fighting as a champion, you're not fighting for yourself. You're now fighting, and your fists carry every single person who's been a part of this journey for you. To see the mentality one has to have when you lose in order to be able to get back up and come back even stronger, to accept defeat and accept it for what it is as a learning experience, and understanding that it doesn't really determine your value as a person as well. The importance of taking things one goal at a time. And there are so many other invaluable lessons regarding not just boxing, but life that Ippo deals with, and the way that we go about growing as people, that it's one of those series that I think everybody should try to read. Really, if you've ever felt down and lacking in motivation, I think Ippo is one of the best series to check out to get that motivation kick-started, to help kind of ground you a little bit, and to read something that is uplifting but is also realistic in the nature of how things are, that no matter how much you progress on a journey, no matter how much you get better, no matter how many victories you can take back to back to back to back, it doesn't make you invincible to the concept, to the reality that is losing at some point in life, whether it's in a boxing match, whether it's in this relationship, whether it's in this friendship, whether it's in the battle, not against your opponent, but against yourself. Ippo tackles all of those things with these different characters, and it's just... I wish I'd read this sooner. Yeah, I wish I had... I don't know, maybe a lot of the stuff would have completely flown over my head. Now, what I'm about to say isn't unique to Ippo, but it's an aspect of it that I love, and it's that within that losing, we get to genuinely see the strong impact it has on the character. In the sense that, and it's a quote I heard one time, where the issue with success is that when we're succeeding, we think that means we're doing everything right. And it isn't until we lose where we get to see what we were actually doing wrong the entire time that inevitably led to our downfall. And we get to see that with a lot of other characters in the series, but specifically with Ippo. And now I kind of want to get into some of the more recent stuff. So for those that aren't caught up with like the last 200 chapters, this is where I would recommend you leave. But for those who are still here, thank you for staying this long. But Ippo, after his back-to-back losses, which I did not see coming, but I'm glad that it happened that way, because it was that thing that I talked about earlier, that Ippo as a series is capable of throwing in these curveballs where you're like, oh, so this is what the character is going to have to deal with now, okay. And seeing this character like Ippo as with other characters in different series that I've given this example many times, like Kenshin, Rurouni Kenshin, Guts and Berserk, Musashi and Vagabond, even Thorfinn, Vinland Saga, like, these are all different examples of characters where they go through very low points in their lives in the story, and they have to contemplate whether or not everything that they've done up to this point was, you know, the right thing to do. And Ippo's struggle is very different. It's a far more lighthearted thing than those other examples that I gave, but still that struggle and that pain of defeat, that this is the end of his journey, and whether or not he's able to cross that line that Takamura set, which is a, you know, symbolism for the actual line Ippo has to cross in order to reach that status, to compete with the very best of the best, to be more than just a boxer, but to be a monster like we see so many of these other characters reach those heights become. And that going a bit against Ippo's nature, something that we see tested earlier, the rage that Ippo's capable of carrying, the death slap. I think that's what my friend called it, where he just smacked the Christ out of somebody, but he genuinely looked more hurt, more angry, more evil than he did in any of his boxing fights. To see if Ippo's going to have to tap into that side, as he's still been training during this hiatus he's taken from the sport of boxing, which the binging experience of this has been great, but I can imagine the, is it weekly, bi-weekly, monthly? I'm not sure. The chapter-to-chapter experience of seeing Ippo out of boxing might be frustrating for some readers, especially with the most recent of chapters being a lot more relaxed. But I think going through this phase of having Ippo out for this long and having to see all these other characters progress not only continues to play into the strengths of the series but the overall cast, but when we finally get that moment of Ippo returning into the sport and once again continuing his quest and his journey to become strong, it'll only be that much sweeter. These hardships that we have to see this character go through will only make the great moments so much sweeter. And again, that's why I said Ippo is sort of this great applicable thing that I think anybody could resonate to, and I think everybody should read at some point, because it is such a beautiful motivational piece for just life, that there's going to be stretches, sometimes very long, unbearable stretches where you don't think you're going to make it through it all, but yet you find a way to pick yourself back up. You find a way to make it through, and sometimes on your own. Sometimes it has to be on your own, but sometimes you're fortunate enough to have the help of others, but at some point you got to get back on the horse and keep going. And it's not a series where it just tells you that. It's legitimately living that through and with the character of Ippo. It's genuinely one of my favorite manga of all time after being caught up, and I can't wait to see more of it. I'm probably going to let the chapters stack up so I found the binge reading experience for Ippo to be very enjoyable. But thank you so much to everyone who's recommended this, and to anybody who hasn't read this, do yourself a favor and do it, because it's so worth it. I'm looking forward to doing some more Hajime no Ippo videos on some of the actual characters and maybe some of the fights, if that's something you would all be interested in. So let me know by leaving a comment, as well as liking the video and subscribing, as that does help a lot. As always, this has been The Masked Man. Hope everyone has a blessed rest of the day, and peace.